What is up, everybody? My name is Pauper Player, and today we are going to be opening up Orzhov Ephemerate. In the last video, we unboxed a Jeskai Ephemerate, which is white, blue, and red, but this version of the deck is white and black. And although both decks are built around the card Ephemerate, they have vastly different win conditions and playstyles. So if you're interested in checking out this deck, the list will be down in the description below. And while you're down there, press the subscribe button. In the next couple weeks, we're going to be opening up Gruul Cascade or Gruul Land Destruction, whatever you want to call it. And I have some other videos planned. I say that every video, but you know, it is what it is. They'll come out eventually. And as per usual, we'll be sleeving our cards in our Dragon Shield matte sleeves and keeping our cards in our Ultimate Guard Boulder deck box. Packing peanut time! So for the very first time on this channel, this is a deck I have not played in Modern before. There was a kid at my LGS that used to play Black-White Prison, but I myself have never played a Black-White deck before, so I'm really excited for this deck. So let's go ahead and kick things off with our key card of the deck, Ephemerate, which is a 1 white mana instant that says exile target creature you control and return to the battlefield under its owner's control. And then it also has Rebound that says if you cast a spell from your hand, exile it as it resolves. At the beginning of your next upkeep, you may cast this card from exile without paying its mana cost. So in order to explain Ephemerate, let me go ahead and bring in one of our creatures from the deck, Spirited Companion, which is a 2 mana 1/1 creature that costs a white and a colorless, that says when Spirited Companion enters the battlefield, draw a card. So let's say on your second turn you played Spirited Companion, and when it entered the battlefield you got to draw a card, and on your third turn you want to do that again. So what you can do is you can cast Ephemerate targeting Spirited Companion. Spirited Companion will get exiled and re-enter the battlefield, causing its enter the battlefield effect to trigger again, allowing you to draw another card. And because you casted Ephemerate from your hand, you also get to use its Rebound effect, meaning that because you casted it from your hand, you get to put it in exile. So now on your next turn, when you go to untap and you go to your upkeep, you can now recast Ephemerate from exile without paying its mana cost. When Ephemerate is casted from exile and it resolves, Ephemerate will now go into your graveyard. You target your creature, being Spirited Companion again, or any of the creatures in this deck. Spirited Companion will blink from the battlefield, re-enter, and now you get to draw a third card. So now between playing Spirited Companion and targeting it with Ephemerate twice, you have now drawn 3 cards from Spirited Companion's enter the battlefield effect, which is fantastic card advantage. Now a couple things about Ephemerate. Number 1, the first creature that you target with Ephemerate does not have to be the same creature when you recast it for its Rebound effect. You can choose different targets when you recast it for its Rebound. The second important thing about Ephemerate is how it interacts with removal spells like Lightning Bolt, which is a 1 red mana instant that deals 3 damage to target creature or player. Let's say you have Spirited Companion on the battlefield and your opponent targets it with Lightning Bolt. In order to save your Spirited Companion, you can target it with Ephemerate, which when Ephemerate resolves, will remove Spirited Companion from the game. It goes into exile. So Ephemerate now resolves, and on the stack, Lightning Bolt no longer has any valid targets because Spirited Companion just disappeared. It vanished. It poofed. So now Lightning Bolt will fizzle, Spirited Companion will re-enter the battlefield, and you'll get to draw a card. Now, on the other hand, let's say you just wanted to Ephemerate one of your creatures. So you targeted your Spirited Companion with Ephemerate, and your opponent decides to Lightning Bolt it in response. This will now kill your Spirited Companion, and your Ephemerate will not go off. Lightning Bolt will go on the stack. It'll bolt Spirited Companion for 3 damage, Spirited Companion will die, and now you will not be able to exile Spirited Companion because it's no longer there, it's dead. The final thing I want to point out is that if you cast Ephemerate on your creature, if your opponent counters it with a card like Counterspell, your Ephemerate will now just go into the graveyard. You don't get your Rebound trigger from that. Okay, so now that we all understand how Ephemerate works for the second video in a row, we have 4 copies of Ephemerate and 4 copies of Spirited Companion. Now what we're going to do is we're going to go through all of our easy to understand creatures first, starting off with Rabid Inspector, which is a 1 white mana 1/2 creature that when it enters a battlefield, you get to investigate, which investigate means that you put a clue token onto the battlefield. Clue token says for 2 mana, you can sacrifice this artifact, draw a card. So we're playing 4 copies of Rabid Inspector. It's just a good turn 1 card that, you know, as we get into the mid game, if we need to draw some cards, we have those extra clue tokens. Next up, we have 4 copies of Inspiring Overseer, which is a 3 mana 2/1 creature that costs a white and 2 colorless, that has flying, and when it enters the battlefield, you gain 1 life and draw a card. Again, just a pretty easy Ephemerate target. It's good against burn because it allows us to just gain a bunch of life and we get to draw a bunch of cards from it, so it's just good value. Next up, we have 3 copies of Core Skyfisher, which is a 2 mana 2/3 creature, a white and a colorless, that also has flying, and when it enters a battlefield, return a permanent you control to its owner's hand. So unlike the Jeskai version of this deck, we have no way of getting Ephemerate back into our hand once it enters the graveyard. So if we run out of Ephemerates, or if we just don't have any in hand, Core Skyfisher allows us to return our creature to our hand so we can play again. So we can bounce our Spirited Companion, replay Spirited Companion, draw a card, and just, you know, kind of do our thing that way. So next up, we have 2 copies of Dawnbringer Cleric with 1 additional copy in the sideboard, which we'll get into later. Dawnbringer Cleric is a 2-mana 1/3 creature, a white and a colorless, that says when it enters a battlefield, you can choose 1 effect. Either Cure Wounds, which allows you to gain 2 life, Dispel Magic, which destroys target enchantment, or Gentle Repose, which exiles target card from a graveyard. Dawnbringer Cleric in main board helps us out with a lot of different matchups. Cure Wounds helps us out with aggro decks and burn decks. Dispel Magic helps us out with Boggles and Mono White Heroic, and Gentle Repose helps us out with like Blue Black Terror and Cycling Storm and all those kind of decks. Being able to Ephemerate Dawnbringer Cleric is extremely strong because then you can gain 6 life, or you can destroy 3 of your opponent's enchantments, or you can exile like all the cards in your opponent's graveyard. Dawnbringer Cleric is an extremely versatile card, and it's like probably like one of the best white cards in Pauper, honestly. So next up, we have 3 copies of Vampire Sovereign, which is a 3/4 flying creature that costs 5 mana, 2 black and 3 colorless, that says when it enters a battlefield, target opponent loses 3 life and you gain 3 life. This is definitely one of my favorite black cards in Pauper, and it's just extremely strong in this deck. I mean, you just get to keep blinking it, and even if you don't, it's a 3/4 flyer. It's really hard to block, it does a lot of damage, it's just a fantastic card. So next up, we have 3 copies of Pegasus Guardian, which is a 3/3 flying creature for 6 mana, a white and 5 colorless, but it also has Adventure. So Adventure is kind of hard to explain, but it's not a complex mechanic. Adventure is basically like a second mini card on top of your main card. Pegasus Guardian's Adventure card is a 2-mana instant called Rescue the Fowl, which costs a white and a colorless, and it says exile target creature you control, then return that creature card to the battlefield under its owner's control. So let's go ahead and talk about how the Adventure mechanic works. Let's say on turn 1, you play Thraben Inspector and you create a clue token. On your second turn, you want to cast Rescue the Fowl for the 2 mana, and you want to blink Thraben Inspector. So you cast Rescue the Fowl, you exile Thraben Inspector, return it to the battlefield, create another clue token. Now the way Adventure works is because you casted this for its Adventure cost, Pegasus Guardian will now go into exile. And when this card goes into exile, you can then play the creature portion of the card for the mana cost that the creature is. So once you have 6 mana, you can cast Pegasus Guardian from exile and put it onto the battlefield. Now Pegasus Guardian as a creature is a 3/3 with flying that says at the beginning of your end step, if a permanent you controlled left the battlefield this turn, create a 1/1 white Pegasus creature token with flying. So if you have Pegasus Guardian on the field and you ephemerate one of your creatures and you bounce your Thraben Inspector, when you go to your end step, you create the Pegasus token. This also works if Pegasus Guardian itself left the battlefield. So like, let's say your opponent tries to use a lightning bolt on it because it only has 3 toughness and lightning bolt can kill it. In response to that lightning bolt, you can use Ephemerate, blink Pegasus Guardian, and then on your end step, because it left the battlefield, you can create a Pegasus token. So a couple things about this card and the Adventure mechanic. Number 1, you do not need to play the Adventure mechanic in order to cast a creature. If on turn 6 you draw Pegasus Guardian, you can just pay 6 mana and just play Pegasus Guardian. You don't have to use Rescue the Fowl. And number 2, if you cast a card's Adventure spell, it is treated as a non-creature spell, so your opponent can counter it with cards like Spell Pierce and Negate. Anyways, all of that was really hard to explain, but with that being said, Pegasus Guardian is in the deck because again, it's a 2-mana ephemerate, and on top of that, when it is on the battlefield, you get to create just a bunch of flying creatures, which is hard for your opponent to deal with every time you're blinking your boys. 6 mana is kind of a lot for a 3/3 creature, but the other things it does is just fantastic. So next up, we have 1 copy of Custody Squire, which is a 3/3 flying creature that costs 5 mana, a white and 4 colorless, and it has Will of the Council. So when Custody Squire enters a battlefield, starting with you, each player votes for an artifact, creature, or enchantment card in your graveyard. Return each card with the most votes or tied for the most votes to your hand. So this card is beyond stupid because it's not meant for a 1v1 format, because you just get whatever creature card you want from the graveyard. It says return each card with the most votes or tied for the most votes to your hand. So whatever creature you pick, your opponent has has to also pick, because if they pick a different creature, then you get both of them. So in this deck, what this card actually says is when it enters the battlefield, you get to return a creature card from your graveyard to your hand, and if your opponent is stupid, you get to return 2 creature cards from your graveyard to your hand. That's all this card is, and it's fantastic. And the last creature we have in this deck is our main win condition, and that is 4 copies of Goliath Paladin, which is a 3/6 creature for 5 mana, a white and 4 colorless. He has vigilance, and when he enters the battlefield, you take the initiative. So now before we get into what the initiative is, let me go ahead and just explain vigilance real quick. When you attack with creatures in Magic, you have to tap them sideways to indicate that they are attacking. And because they're tapped sideways, this also means that when your opponent attacks, you are unable to block. What vigilance means is that when your creature attacks, you don't have to tap it. It attacks without tapping, meaning that it can also block on your opponent's attack step. Goliath Paladin having vigilance specifically is really strong because he's a 3/6, so he does decent damage, and he's also like really tanky. He has a lot of health. So your opponent will have to block with at least 2 to 3 creatures in order to even kill him, and then when your opponent's attacking, I mean, he's just a great blocker. Like 6 toughness is a lot of toughness. Okay, so let's go ahead and talk about the initiative. So the initiative is a board state mechanic that says whenever one or more creatures a player controls deals combat damage to you, that player takes the initiative. The reason why it's worded this way is so that every time you and your opponent attacks each other and deals combat damage to one another, you guys take turn taking the initiative. So we play Goliath Paladin, take the initiative, and then when our opponent swings in with their flying creature on their next turn, they take the initiative. And then on our turn, when we attack with Goliath Paladin, we take back the initiative, and it just goes back and forth. Now, when you take the initiative, you venture into the Undercity. Now, this is about to get a little convoluted because the Undercity is one of 4 dungeons in Magic the Gathering, but the Undercity is the only dungeon that you can enter using the initiative. So you play Goliath Paladin, take the initiative, and you enter the first room of the Undercity, which is Secret Entrance, which says search your library for a basic land card, reveal it, put it into your hand, then shuffle. Now let's say it's your opponent's turn and they are unable to take the initiative because they aren't able to attack you. Great. Now on your turn, on your upkeep, you take the initiative again. So you can go to Forge, which is put 2 +1/+1 counters on target creature. You can also go to Lost Well, it doesn't really matter. But now what you can do on your turn is you can cast Ephemerate to target your Goliath Paladin. Goliath Paladin goes into exile, enters a battlefield. You take the initiative, so now you can go into the next room. Preferably you go into Trap, which target player loses 5 life. This is going to be how you kill your opponent. So now let's say it's your opponent's turn and they are able to attack you in the air. Let's say you don't have a flyer out and they attack you with a flying creature. You're unable to block. Now they take the initiative and they go into the first room, which allows them to search your library for a basic land and put it into their hand. Now it's your turn again, and Ephemerate comes out of exile because of the rebound effect, allowing you to retarget your Goliath Paladin. So now you get to blink your Goliath Paladin, enter the battlefield, and now you take the initiative again, now allowing you to draw a card with Archives, or if you went this direction, you can go down to Catacombs, which allows you to create a skeleton creature token with Menace. Hopefully, preferably, you have one more way of being able to blink your Goliath Paladin. That way you can exile him, bring him back on battlefield, and go into the last room, which is reveal the top 10 cards of your library. Put a creature card from among them onto the battlefield with 3 +1/+1 counters on it. It gains hexproof until your next turn, then shuffle. Now, when you complete the Undercity and you are out of the dungeon, if your opponent fails to take the initiative from you through combat or by playing their own initiative creature, then you will automatically venture back into the first room of the Undercity at the beginning of your upkeep on your next turn. This also applies to your opponent if they themselves were the last ones to have the initiative. So we have all the creatures in the deck to be able to block our opponent's creatures from attacking and gaining the initiative. Additionally, we can use Ephemerate before damage is resolved during combat in order to save our creatures from dying, and then they can re-enter the battlefield and trigger more abilities. But anyways, that's our main win condition of the deck. Like I said, we have 4 copies of Goliath Paladin. So next up, we have 1 copy of Unmake, which is a 3 hybrid mana instant that exiles target creature. Hybrid mana means that you could spend either one or the other in order to cast a spell. In total, it costs 3 mana, but you have to do in any combination of either 3 black mana or 3 white mana, or maybe 2 white mana and 1 black mana, or 2 black mana and 1 white mana. Just as long as you spend 3 mana in any one of these combinations, it doesn't matter. You can cast Unmake, but yeah, it just exiles a target creature. It's just a pretty good removal spell. Next up, we have 1 copy of Suffocating Fumes. We have an additional copy in Sideboard, but this is a 3 mana instant, a black and a colorless. Creatures your opponents control get -1/-1 till end of turn and has cycling 2. meaning that you could spend 2 mana to discard this card and draw a card. This card's really good if your opponent's playing a lot of small creatures. You know, if they have a bunch of 1/1s on the field, this will just wipe them all out, so that's why we have that in this deck. And then finally, we have 4 copies of Cast Down, which is a 2 mana instant, destroy target non-legendary creature, costs a black and a colorless. This card's extremely good in Pauper because we're using commons, there are no legendary creatures. So this is a 2 mana kill anything, so we have 4 copies of that. So let's go ahead and start off our land base with Orzhov Basilica, which enters the battlefield tapped, and when it enters the battlefield, return a land you control to your hand. This is what's known as a bounce land. Now, you cannot play Orzhov Basilica on your first turn because it's the only land on the battlefield. So when it enters a battlefield, it then has to target itself, and then it bounces itself back to your hand, and now you have no land on turn 1. So you have to play Orzhov Basilica on turn 2 or any turn after that. And the cool thing about your bounce land is even though you're bouncing a land to your hand, this taps for 2 mana. So Orzhov Basilica doesn't tap for a white or a black, it taps for both white and black. So this creates 2 mana, it's a really good card. We're running only 2 copies of it because if you have one in your starting hand, it kind of sucks because again, you can't play it on turn 1. But you know, it is nice to see kind of like mid-game to just kind of help you ramp up. So next up, we have 2 copies of Obscura Battlefront. This is a land that when it enters a battlefield, you sacrifice it. And when you do, you can search your library for a basic plains, island, or swamp and put it onto the battlefield tapped. Then shuffle your library and you gain 1 life. This card just helps us filter our lands. It allows us to go grab whichever basic color we need. Maybe our starting hand has a lot of swamps and we have the Obscura storefront, so now we can use this to go fetch ourselves a plains, and we get to gain 1 life, which helps us against burn. Next up, we have 1 copy of Mortuary Mire, which enters the battlefield tapped, and when it enters the battlefield, you may put target creature card from your graveyard on top of your library. Add 1 black mana to your mana pools. Next up, we have 2 copies of Bojuka Bog, which enters the battlefield tapped, and when it enters the battlefield, exile all cards from target player's graveyard. There's a lot of decks in Pauper right now that like to really utilize their graveyards, like Blue-Black Terror, for example. So being able to just nuke an opponent's graveyard could be really detrimental to their game plan, so running 2 copies. Next up, we have 4 copies of Scoured Barrens, which enters the battlefield tapped, and when it enters the battlefield, you gain 1 life, and it could tap for either a white or a black mana. This is a land we primarily want to target our bounce land with. We could play this on a turn, gain a life, and then later on, we could play our Orzhov Basilica, bounces to our hand, play it again, gain another life. It's not like a crazy wombo combo, but I mean, it gains us extra life. And then finally, we are running 3 basic swamps, and we are running 8 basic plains. So let's go ahead and get into the sideboard. We got an easy one today. We have the 1 copy of Dawnbringer Cleric that I mentioned earlier, and then the 1 extra copy of Suffocating Fumes. So next up, we got 3 copies of Diabolic Edict, which is a 2 mana instant, a black and a colorless. Target player sacrifices a creature. This is our way of dealing with our opponent's creatures that have hexproof or are indestructible because they can't be destroyed and they can't be targeted. Diabolic Edict targets the player, and so they have to sacrifice a creature. So if your opponent's playing Slippery Boggle and they have a bunch of enchantments and it's like a 20/20, cast Diabolic Edict, now they have to sacrifice it and lose everything. So next up, we have 4 copies of Lone Missionary, which is a 2/1 creature that costs 2 mana, a white and a colorless. When it enters the battlefield, you gain 4 life. Now, we're playing 4 copies of these for burn. Obviously, this is really good because if we can Ephemerate Lone Missionary, we can gain up to 12 life, which is like really shitty for burn. So yeah, we're running 4 copies of him. He's just a good card to blink. Next up, we're running 3 copies of Revoke Existence because I'm poor and Dust to Dust is expensive. Revoke Existence is a 2 mana sorcery, a white and a colorless, exile target artifact or enchantment. We're running 3 copies because it's just a good card that allows us to exile our opponent's stuff. And then finally, we got 3 copies of Journey to Nowhere, which is a 2 mana enchantment, a white and a colorless. When it enters a battlefield, exile target creature. When Journey to Nowhere leaves a battlefield, return the exiled card to the battlefield under its owner's control. If our opponent has 1 specific creature that's really strong against us and we just need to get rid of it, we have Journey to Nowhere to exile it. So that is going to be Orzhov Ephemerate for Pauper. I'm really excited for this deck. Like I mentioned earlier, this is going to be the first time I've ever really played a black-white deck in any Magic format. So I'm excited to play it at the LGS tonight during our Pauper event. If you enjoyed this deck, the list will be down in the description below. And while you're down there, press the subscribe button. It keeps me motivated to keep making content for you. And like I said, in the next couple weeks, we'll be opening up Gruul Cascade, which I'm not really excited about because I'll have to re-explain how the Undercity works. And that took a really long time. But thank you guys so much for watching, and we will see you in the next one.